Welcome student. In the lecture of Watershed Management of MMSc Geography 2nd, I Dr. D.N. Pawar, Assistant Professor in Geography, KSKW Arts Science and Commerce College, Shidko, Nasik, welcome you all again in the lecture of Characteristics of Watershed. Friends, in the previous video lecture, we had discussed about the size, shape and physiographic characteristics of watershed. Today, we will discuss the remaining characteristics of watershed. We had discussed about the elements of watershed, then the size, shape, geology as well as the physiography of watershed. Now, we will discuss about the soil factor. Soil is very major essential component of any watershed because it determines the agroeconomy or agriculture pattern, it determines the cropping pattern, it determines the surface runoff, soil loss. So soil is very significant component of any watershed. It has three major characteristics. Every soil having three types of characteristics: hydrological properties of soil, physical properties of soil, as well as chemical properties of soil. Hydrological properties gives you idea about what is the behavior of water in the soil. It is also required for the cropping pattern or the growing of plants. Physical pattern gives you the textural properties, and chemical properties gives you the idea about the chemical composition of soil which determine the quality of soil. All these three components are interrelated to each other. It affects by several factors. If we consider Jain's equation of soil formation, soil is a function of climate, living organism, parent rock, relief and time as well as local factors. So therefore, these all three characteristics of soil determine the quality of soil, and this quality of soil is determined the different characteristics of watershed. If we consider the major effect of soil on the watershed, that is on the land use pattern, because the soil quality determines which type of land is suitable for which type of cropping pattern. For example, if we have to use the soil or a land for the built up area, so it will be defined the quality of soil may be very poor. If we need the soil for the agriculture area, it will require a good soil cover accordingly. Soil characteristics of watershed includes the productivity of land, soil depth, porosity, textural properties, that is sand, silt, clay, loam, soil types on the basis of textural properties as well as colors, then soil moisture. All these characteristics of soil affect on agricultural cropping pattern as well as its development. Soil hydrological parameters such as infiltration rate and hydraulic conductivity affect on runoff or surface runoff potential. Soil textural properties such as hydrological soil group on the basis of organic matter and soil texture affects or which determine or which are the major component in the estimation of surface runoff as well as soil loss. The land capability and land suitability croppings, land, soil, plant, crop suitability maps can be prepared or analyzed, and maps on the basis of soil characteristics which includes hydrological, physical and chemical properties of soil of any watershed. And considering entire the scenario, soil resources is major function for the evaluation of land resources of any watershed for its development or sustainable development. The next characteristics of watershed is land use. We have already discussed the use of land means the practice of land by the human for various purpose. For example, built up land, cropping land means agriculture land, water body. There are several types of land use. So mapping and monitoring of land use, land cover and its statistics is required for watershed planning and preparation of development policy as well as conservation measures of any watershed. Land use is man-made and it is major input parameter of estimation of surface runoff, estimation of soil loss. Land use is considered or includes built up land, that is road and settlements, etc., agricultural land, forest plantation, dams and reservoir. The current land use pattern is required for the potential land use planning of watershed. Nowadays, remote sensing technology, that is satellite imageries and aerial photographs, is very much significant data source for the estimation of temporal and spatial changes of land use, land cover of any watershed. And GIS technology is backbone and it is very useful to estimate the statistically as well as aerial coverage of different layers of land use and land cover of that watershed, and it will be helpful for the planning and development of watershed, its conservation measures. Therefore, land use is also required to develop a rainwater harvesting techniques through a various mechanical measures of the watershed. So this is about the land use characteristics of watershed. The next characteristics of watershed is drainage. So drainage of watershed includes the drainage pattern, the drainage density, the drainage frequency, channel network and its order number, stream length area and area under various streams. All these are the subcomponents under the drainage of watershed. Drainage of watershed already we have discussed is controlling by the geology. Drainage of watershed determine the area, size, shape of watershed. Drainage of watershed determine the surface runoff and discharge of that particular watershed. Drainage affects on the surface water flow characteristics, that is majorly on the surface runoff. It affects on the soil erosion of watershed. Stream density affects on the peak runoff, that is if the density of stream will be high, the runoff will be peak, and the density of stream will be low, the runoff will be low accordingly. The drainage pattern of the watershed varies, like dendritic pattern of drainage, radial pattern, rectangle pattern, trellis pattern, angular pattern and centripetal pattern. Stream order increases as the stream number and it affects on area, runoff and many other drainage characteristics of watershed. The drainage characteristic also required to develop a drainage line treatment plan and structure for the watershed management or mechanical measures. So this is all about the drainage characteristics of watershed. The next characteristics is climate. Climate includes the zone and the watershed types. On the basis of climate, we can classify the watershed as a drought prone region watershed, as in the watershed will be in drought region, it will give you different characteristics. If watershed will be of a ice area, it covered by ice area, it has different characteristics. It is a semi-arid region, it will be different characteristics. In short, on the basis of climate zone, watershed can be classified. Drought prone zone versus severe runoff regions. Then hydrological cycle is one of the most essential component of watershed. If hydrological cycle is very clear, it means that the watershed water capacity or water problem is very less. Effect of climate on land use, agriculture activity, settlement, economic development, then temperature and rainfall also affect on several characteristics of watershed. For example, soil, moisture, soil plant combination, wind direction, wind velocity, humidity. Severe precipitation means the maximum runoff. So climate factor, especially the infiltration, precipitation, which includes the rain as well as different aspect of precipitation affect on the surface runoff as well as soil loss of the watershed. Hydrology characteristics of watershed include the rainfall intensity, time of concentration, rainfall duration, infiltration, evaporation and surface runoff. Again, these hydrological characteristics also determined by the drainage pattern, climate condition, physiography, then geology, size and shape of the watershed. Vegetation is another aspect of the watershed. Vegetation affects surface runoff. It reduces the soil loss. If vegetation will be less, it shows the barren land and fallow land. It contribute more or maximum surface runoff and soil loss. Vegetation cover maintain ecology of any watershed. Vegetation cover influence the cloud condition, local winds, and it also affect on rainfall. The vegetation plantation and its protection is major activity of the watershed management. Vegetation types and spatial density determines erosion and sedimentation process of the watershed. Vegetation reduce raindrop velocity and reduce its soil erosion. Vegetation also has impact on the moisture of soil loss. In short, vegetation also affect several sub-characteristics of watershed. Friends, I am again and again speaking about the interrelationship of different characteristics of watershed. For example, size depends upon the aerial coverage, drainage frequency, drainage pattern, then geology affect on the size, shape, vegetation cover, then land use land cover, vegetation determined by the geology, land use land cover pattern, size, shape, climate condition. Every characteristics of watershed is a part of mix pattern. Now the next pattern of the socio-economic characteristics of watershed. Students, we had already discussed about in the second unit that is related to the management of watershed. The watershed is not only a geographical entity. It is a geopolitical, it is socio-economical entity also, and therefore for the any development of any watershed, socio-economic factor is need to consider, because unless and until if we cannot develop the local people's participation, if we cannot develop them as a socially and economically, watershed cannot be sustained. For the sustainable development, socio-economic development is also required, and therefore in every watershed the participation of local people, which means that the participatory approach and its response from the local community of the watershed is need to the consideration. If the participation of local people is there, the watershed development plan can be implemented very successfully. Population size determine the capacity of watershed and its effect on natural resources, because carrying capacity means if population size is optimum, so optimum utilization of natural resources. If the carrying capacity is less and the population will be high, though it affect on the exploitation of natural resources. So accordingly, population size affect on the natural resources of the watershed. Different demographic characteristics, which include the literacy, sex ratio, then developed and undeveloped area. These factors affect on the socio-economic development of the watershed, and it affect on the entire ecosystem of watershed. Economic activity and growth, which type of economic activity is there, if the area is nearby the urban fringe or urban region, or area is tribal or area is developed, so it will also determine the different that is the participation approach as well as the development strategies of and successfulness of that watershed management. Then farming practices. If modern practices is there, it's good. If they following the scientific practices, it is also good. But if the farmer following traditional practices, it means that it is not good for that watershed development. Education and health factor, tribal and non-tribal areas, because this issue directly and indirectly affect on the development of watershed of plan or implementation of watershed plan as well as monitoring and sustainable development of that watershed. And finally, socio-political factor is also need to consider for the characteristics of watershed management. This is about socio-economic characteristics. Friends, here the topic of different characteristics of watershed is completed. Now, here some links are given for the additional learning of characteristics watershed. Students, all these characteristics of watershed we had discussed about. This is as per the syllabi of Savitribai Phule Pune University. But apart from this, there are several characteristics of watershed, and if we categorize these watershed characteristics into three types, that is aerial characteristics, linear characteristics, as well as the relief characteristics of watershed. But in this unit, we have discussed the basic concept about different characteristics of watershed. This is all about the characteristics of watershed. Hope you will understood about the major characteristics of watershed. Thank you.